All right, guys, the nervous system. The nervous system. So, of the nervous system, we're looking at directional terminology. When we're talking about the brain and what scientists, professors, researchers, the words they use when they're talking about the brain, the directional terminology. So, the superior and inferior. So, when someone says, oh, that at the superior part of the brain, at the upper part of the brain, the inferior, the bottom, or below the superior is the inferior, right? Like I say, right there on the inferior part of the brain. There's also the dorsal and the ventral. Think about the dorsal fin, right? So when we think about when we're thinking about a dolphin, right? It's on top of their back. So the dorsal is the top, the ventral is the bottom. But if we're looking at a human body, we say the ventral area of the body, it's like around the stomach area. And so it's kind of the dorsal is sort of the back when you're looking at the human, right? The anterior, obviously, the anterior means the front, and then posterior would mean the back. So my professor said rostral versus caudal. He said he'll never use those words, but rostral is just like anterior. Rostral means the front, like the rostrum is the nose, part of the nose structure. Caudal means the back. Maybe like, oh, you keep coddling him, like holding him. I don't know. I don't know if that even relates. Then you have the medial, medial meaning the middle of the brain, and then lateral. Lateral means the sides of the brain. So medial, or the medial part, the medial area of the cranium, the middle area of the brain, the lateral sides. Contralateral, the opposite side, contrary. Contralateral, the opposite side. Ipsilateral, same side. Proximal means close, proximity, right? Proximal, close by. Distal, or no, not distal, distal. Distal part of the brain. Think about distant. Distant part of the brain. So sagittal, side view. So sagittal is the side view of the brain. Coronal is the front and back of the brain. Axial means the top of the brain. Um, so those are just some sort of directional terminology that we were being taught. So general organization of the nervous system. So the nervous system is made up of the central nervous system, the CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, the PNS. So the peripheral is made up of the somatic, or soma being the body, right? Soma and psyche, psyche being the psyche being the conscious. I'm tripping. I don't really know what I'm talking about. So we got the peripheral made up of the somatic, which is the body, and then the autonomic, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So, mm, so sympathetic nervous system is like the fight or flight. Think about sympathy. It wants to protect you. So when you feel you're being threatened, that part of your brain is going to alert the rest of your body to react, right? And then the parasympathetic is supposed to bring you back to equilibrium. It's supposed to bring that body back to homeostasis. Like when it's properly in balance, you're going to read what you think might be a threat, and you're going to be able to analyze that threat and realize it's not a threat. And then the parasympathetic is supposed to calm you down, right? And that's why it's also good for sex, like to be calm during sex. You're not supposed to be so because someone had asked a question, also like something about does it always work that way? Is the sympathetic always for fight or flight? They said actually the parasympathetic, which calms you down, you think would be bad for maybe like so things like sex and things like for using the bathroom. You really want to be calm at those moments, so the parasympathetic actually works for that. It makes a lot of sense. So and then the supporting players of the central nervous system. So the central nervous system is surrounded by the meninges, which are tissues. Think about meningitis, right? And the CNS is actually cushioned by the cerebral spinal fluid. So the CSF, okay, the cerebral spinal fluid. And then so the CNS, the central nervous system, has four ventricles. So the ventricles, they're actually holes in the brain that allow fluid to penetrate the brain, to cushion the brain. And it's these are the So these ventricles allow the cerebral spinal fluid to probably penetrate, or maybe at least the fluid that cushions the brain. I don't know if it's the cerebral spinal fluid, but and then so yeah, the four ventricles are actually the holes in the brain that allow the fluid in the brain to penetrate the brain to give it cushion that it needs. So that's interesting. The four ventricles of the CNS. So the development of the nervous system. So three layers in the nervous system form 16 days after fertilization. So when the egg and the sperm meet and they fertilize, so 16 days after, the endoderm is the first layer of the nervous system that forms. It has to do with the digestive and the respiratory systems. It's called the endoderm. Let me try to remember this. Then you got the mesoderm. It has to do with the muscles and the connective tissue. And then you have the ectoderm, what has to do with the skin and the nervous system. Yeah, I'm right. But pay attention here, because the ectoderm is important. It's actually part of the process of forming the brain and the spinal cord. So here's what happens. There's something called the neural tube, like a neural tube. Part of the ectoderm, which makes up the skin and the nervous system, pinches off to give rise to the neural tube. So the neural tube is actually, it's created by the ectoderm, which is responsible for forming our skin and our nervous system. But it's also part of the ectoderm pinches off to give rise to the neural tube. Part of the neural tube becomes the parts of the brain, and the remainder becomes the spinal cord. Interesting, the neural tube. Oh, let's keep going. So stages of neuron development. This is what we learned recently, so I'm not as like it's not as embedded in my memory as like the other stuff that I just read. Even some of this other stuff, like the three layers, um, the development of the nervous system, three layers form 16 days after fertilization. So all this shit's new to me. So stages of neuron development. So the first stage is neurogenesis. Neurogenesis. Then you got migration. So the neurons are actually sent to the locations in which it's like specificity, like that neuron is being these neurons are being distributed and given particular jobs. Actually, when they're sent away, so I think that, let's say, they're sent through migration before they're actually even given the role, because if it's neurogenesis, then it's migration, and then it's differentiation. So neuron actually gets their specific task. I think they're already probably there and then get the task given to them, right? They're just there at the part of the nervous system, and they're not really doing shit yet, right? They're just hanging out until they're actually given their job. And then you got synaptogenesis, then you got myelination, then you have the synaptic pruning. Synaptic pruning is the leftover parts of the neuron that's not needed, right? It might even be put through recycle, where it gets recycled, and well, no, I think it's just pruned. I think it's just, and so some of these, sometimes when you have too much neurons that don't have a specific purpose, it can actually be bad for a human's brain. So you got the central nervous system. So the central nervous system is made up of the spinal cord and the brain. So the central nervous system is made up of the spinal cord and the brain. So here are the layers of so at the end of the spinal cord is the brain, right? But within the brain are these different branches. So you have the brainstem, the cerebellum, the midbrain, the forebrain, and the cerebrum. The cerebrum is when you look at a brain and you see like the chunky fatness that you assume to be a muscle, that's the cerebrum. That's like actually like the most important part of the brain that really differentiates us, and it separates us from any other mammal alive with the brain. And so that's the cerebrum. Oh, like that, damn, that person's cerebral, like that person's smart, that person can pick up on things. We use these words that we don't really know where they come from, but it comes from the cerebrum part of the brain, which are made up of different lobes. And so we got the spinal cord. There's a dude like talking to a girl, I can tell he's nervous. I was like kiss her or something. It's pretty funny. He gave her flowers and shit. That's awesome, man. Happy for him. Pretty sure he's new to the game. So then we got the spinal cord. So spinal cord is made up of 5 divisions. So we have eight cervical nerves in the spinal cord, which is pretty much all around the neck area. And we have 12 thoracic nerves, which are the nerves in the chest. It says we have lower, or we lose superior, lose exterior. Anyway, no, I don't know what I'm saying. I just made a little. And then we have 5 lumbar nerves. So lumbar has to do with the lower back, which controls our legs. So imagine damaging that. Then we have 5 sacral nerves. It's funny, he made a joke. One of his students said, hey, those seem like the sacred nerves because they have to do with our bowels, our bladder, our sexual function. These are the 5 sacral nerves. Then we have one coccygeal nerve. One coccygeal nerve, which has to do with the tailbone. Yeah, it has to do with the tailbone. And then today's class, we're getting into it right now. So the organization of the spinal cord. Organization of the spinal cord. So in the spinal cord, we have gray matter and we have white matter. So the gray matter actually makes up the medial part of the spinal cord, which is the middle part of the spinal cord. So if you were to cut the spinal cord and you see different layers, it would be that center layer. It's gray matter, made up of cell bodies, composed of cell bodies, dendrites, and interneurons. So the gray matter actually processes information. And the white matter, which is made of myelin, that's why it's white, because myelin actually is like a layer that protects the neuron as it goes through the process of being sent out through the body. And so the myelin, that's why the white matter, which is so if you cut the spinal cord, you have the gray matter in between, which processes information. And then the outer layers, the lateral areas of the spinal cord, which are the sides, have to do with sending information. They are composed of axons, so they send info. So gray matter processes information. The white lateral area of the spinal cord sends information. Then you have the ventral root of the nerve. So remember, ventral means bottom, the bottom root of the nerve. It sends motor information to the muscles. And then you have the dorsal root of the nerve. So the ventral will be more in the front. It's considered the bottom, but the back is the top, right? It's like if we're leaned over, the dorsal would be on our back, like a dolphin, right? So the dorsal is the top, which is the back. It's the root of the nerve. It receives sensory information from the body. Hey, what's up, lady? So okay, now we're working on the brain stem. So that was the spinal cord, and now so we're done with the spinal cord, and after the spinal cord is the brain. But before we get to the actual cerebrum of the brain, the part of the brain that everybody knows, right, what it looks like. And so we're getting to the brain stem, which is the very beginning of the brain. It's like pretty much in between the cerebrum, but it's a little complex. So we got the brain stem, which is called the medulla. Think about the medulla oblongata, and what it is. So it connects to the spinal cord. It's primarily composed of white matter. So white matter, so it sends information. Think about how information is getting sent from the brain, goes getting sent out from the brain into the spinal cord, right? And even vice versa. So its job is it's not part of the cerebrum, so it's not necessarily processing. It's sending information, but it's still part of the brain because it's the brain stem. And part of the brain stem makes up the medulla oblongata. You've heard of it in movies before. So it's primarily composed of white matter. So has the myelin. It's on the side, composed of axons. It sends information. So the medulla has a lot to do with breathing and our heart rate. So majority of information going to and from higher cortical structures. So higher cortical structures will be the cerebrum, the lobes of the brain that have more to do with our auditory system, our visual system, speaking, our smell. So majority of information going to and from higher cortical structures passes through the medulla, obviously because it got to get from the medulla to the rest of the body. It contains cell bodies responsible for basic behaviors, breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, sleep arousal. Remember, it's somewhere right here. So damage to the medulla is fatal. Damage to the medulla is fatal. So another part of the brainstem is called the pons. It's called the pons. So pons actually translates to bridge, which makes sense, right? It connects the medulla to higher brain structure, to the higher brain structure. So it's like the medulla, the pons, and everything else coming up here. And so it's mostly white matter again. It's not processing information, it's sending information. Yeah, it sends information from the brain throughout the body, the nervous system, because it's made up of white matter. So some input and output crosses to the other side of the brain here contains cell bodies for sleep and arousal. So the pons is for sleep and arousal. The medulla is for breathing, blood pressure, heart rate, sleep arousal. And after the pons, so you got the spinal cord, you got the brain stem, which is the medulla. So okay, you got the spinal cord, you got the medulla, you got the pons, and now we have the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, it's funny, you got the brain right here, and then you have like a chunk of brain right here, a little chunk of brain. And it says that bats, I forgot what it's called. What is it called? Hmm. Something about I wrote it down somewhere. I can't. Oh, echolocution. I guess any sort of animals with echolocution, they have a bigger cerebellum. So the cerebellum is considered to be the little brain because it's like almost like a tumor. It's like this extra chunk of brain right here. So it's called the little brain. It has to do with coordination. So it's one of those things when you get drunk, it affects when you drink alcohol. That's what's being affected in your brain is the cerebellum because the cerebellum is very important to when it comes to coordination in the body. Puts together sequences of movements. So it's made up of gray and white matter. Has to do with balance, obviously coordination and balance, sequences of movements. Damage here affects skilled movements, may impact speech, one of the first brain structures impacted by alcohol. And so we have the medulla, we have the pons, we have the cerebellum, and now we have the midbrain. So midbrain is made up of two structures. These are two structures I really wasn't familiar with. The first one is called the tegmentum. So the tegmentum contains structures linked to motor functions. Something called the red nucleus and the substantia nigra. Damage to these leads to Parkinson's disease, since the tegmentum has to do with motor functions. If you damage the red nucleus and the substantia nigra, then you're going to have problems with function, right? Parkinson's disease has to do, old people, they start shaking and stuff. So the second structure of the midbrain is called the tectum. There's two parts to it. The superior colliculi, which has to do with your vision, and the inferior colliculi has to do with audition, the auditory, the being able to hear and process sound. And our teacher gave us a description. If you go into the brain and you kind of get to where these two structures are of the midbrain, you get to the tectum, there's like, so the superior colliculi is because it's located above the inferior colliculi. So it's like these four bigger circular parts of the brain, and under it are two smaller circular parts of the brain. That's the inferior colliculi. And remember, the eyes are above. Well, actually, no, I could be wrong because then we have the ears. So the eyes are above the ears. Anyway, the superior colliculi, which are above the inferior colliculi, when we look at the structure of the brain. So the superior colliculi, that's part of the tectum, is for vision. And the inferior colliculi, that's part of the tectum, is for auditory, for sound, for processing sound. So that's the part of the midbrain. The two structures of the midbrain are the tegmentum, which has to do with motor functions. Okay, so actually these motor functions, the tegmentum, which is part of the midbrain structure, also contains structures linked to reward systems. I totally skipped this part. So the tegmentum contains structures linked to motor functions. Red nucleus and substantia nigra contain structures linked to reward systems. And then there's a ventral tegmental area, which is ventral meaning the bottom, right? These are kind of, So it contains structures linked to reward systems. Um, I guess research has shown even addictions, right? Reward systems have to do with addictions. So let's move on to the forebrain. The forebrain. There's two parts of the forebrain. So the forebrain, the diencephalon. The first one is the thalamus. So the thalamus has. So think about it. We're moving a little more up. We're moving a little more up the brain now, getting to the main part of the brain, which is the cerebrum. But now we're on the forebrain. It's the diencephalon. I guess dien means two, so that means two parts of this part of the brain. So the forebrain, the diencephalon, it's the thalamus. It's considered to be the air traffic controller. Remember, so information's being sent from the brainstem. We got the medulla, got the pons, the cerebellum. Remember, these are mostly, or the cerebellum is kind of the little brain, but when you go up through the medulla and the pons, these are still white matter. So these white matters send information. So if you think about when that information finally gets to the thalamus actually considered to be the air traffic controller. Is what made it more easier for us to understand. My professor said. So the thalamus sorts out information and sends it to parts of the brain. Remember, this is after neurogenesis and differentiation. Remember, this is when the neurons are already formed. And so the thalamus contains different groups of nuclei, different groups of cell bodies. It's a relay station for incoming information. Some send information to specific brain areas, hence the air traffic controller. Others send information more diffusely. Um, something's interesting about the thalamus. I guess some scientists didn't think smell went through, but smell actually goes through the thalamus. Smell. So all five senses go through the thalamus. Um, so remember, there's two parts. It's the forebrain, so it's made up of two parts. So it's the diencephalon. It's made of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus actually has to do with food, thirst, and sex. So it's considered to be the positive emotions of this part of the brain, right? So the hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, which is automatically protects you when something doesn't seem right, right? It's there for your survival through evolutionary, so much, just for so many years. So, and then the endocrine system. So the endocrine, when somebody's an endocrinologist, they have to do with the hormones of the body, right? So the endocrine. So the hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system. So the body's hormones, and it helps maintain homeostasis. So think about it. Think about the body's temperature, right? The temperature of the body. Homeostasis means balance, back to regularity, back to equilibrium. So that's why it's the autonomic nervous system. It automatically kicks in. You got the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. Remember, the autonomic system deals with the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system kicks in your fight or flight. The parasympathetic calms you down. People with traumatic, have been through traumatic situations, and these things have altered their brain functioning. They're way off homeostasis. They're way off equilibrium. They have traumatic. They have triggers. Hence the word triggers, right? So the hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system, the hormonal nervous system, because there's certain hormones that are released that actually help you calm your body down, right? Or like cortisol. Um, Too much cortisol actually is bad for you. It's your body's off of homeostasis and off of equilibrium. So now we are past the forebrain, the diencephalon, and we're working our way up. And now we're at the forebrain. Now we're at again, obviously, right? And now we're at the limbic system. We're at the limbic system now. So the limbic system, sometimes called the fifth lobe, but our teacher didn't really like that. He'd rather it be called the system. So actually, the limbic system is actually considered to be the negative emotion part of the brain. So because and you'll know why, right? So the limbic system is made up of different parts. So this limbic system, sometimes called the fifth lobe, involved in processing drives, motivation, and emotions, All these pertain to each other. It contains many structures, including hippocampus, the fornix, the amygdala, the cingulate cortex. Also, sometimes the hypothalamus is included as well. So the cingulate cortex has to do with love, and the hippocampus, memory and emotions. The hippocampus, and also obviously PTSD in the hippocampus because of memories and emotion. Uh, yeah. So the hypothalamus is considered to be the positive emotions, the food, thirst, and sex. The amygdala, that's part of the limbic system, is considered to be the negative emotions. The amygdala, which is fear and anxiety. The amygdala is said to hold, it stores the traumatic situations you've been through, and it stores those memories inside of your brain. Actually, the hippocampus actually does that. The amygdala is like the alarm system in your brain, and then if something triggers that, the memory and the emotion system. So think about the amygdala. It's kind of the irrational part of your brain. The amygdala is the irrational part of your brain that wants to react. Then you have the cerebral cortex that's there to, it's more rational. It's more a reasonable part of your brain. Okay, now we're gonna move down again. So now we're still at the forebrain, the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia, which I'm not even familiar with this at all. I never even heard of that before. So the basal ganglia is made up of three main structures: the caudate nucleus, the putamen globus pallidus, involved in motor system, which is movement. So if that gets affected, it's related to Parkinson's disease as well. So now we're at the cerebrum. Now we're at when you look at a brain and you see it looks kind of like has like creases in it, little wrinkles in it. That's the cerebrum. That's the cerebral cortex. It's what separates us from other animals. It's what separates us the most from other animals. So he went down a little historical phrenology. Phrenology is just like, let me explain. So phrenology was created by a man named Franz Joseph Gall. He proposed the idea that the brain is composed of distinct faculties, which meaning distinct, like specific parts of the brain have distinct capabilities or operations or commands or duties they have to fulfill. Faculties, right? And he's kind of right. So Franz Joseph Gall, he proposed the idea that the brain is composed of distinct faculties in distinct areas, which he's right. But when he came out, they didn't have the technology, they didn't have the imaging techniques that we have today. So he had to do some peculiar experiments. If you look him up, if you look phrenology up on Google and you type and you click on images, you'll see a picture of just like a brain and a bunch of squares, like this little indicators of, okay, this is where love is at, this is where poetry is at, this is where anger is at, this is where hunger is at, so he was a creator of phrenology. So was phrenology correct? So the key concept of phrenology was different areas of the brain do different things, but the rest of it was misguided. The specific traits they try to localize were wrong: funny, thoughtful, cheerful, hopeful, and destructive. They thought the brain was a muscle. Again, this is probably one of the important, the brain is not a muscle. Muscles get bigger as you do something. So what happened was these people that were phrenologists, they thought if you worked a part of the brain more, it would become larger and it would cause a bump on the skull to form. So think about this. If you take your kid to one of these phrenologists, he has a bump on his head, and that bump happens to be where he's able to do poetry, you're gonna tell that parent of the subject or the patient, like, I think he's gonna be really good at poetry. You should make him do poetry. So can you imagine that? It's kind of like astrology in a sense, you know? That guy's name's Franz, the phrenologist, Franz Gall, or Franz Joseph Gall. It's very interesting. All right, guys, so the cerebrum, it's made up of two hemispheres. Remember, the right and left hemisphere, right? You know that little split right here? Then we have the corpus callosum, which is like the bridge. It actually connects both parts of the brain that allows electrical activity to go from one side of the brain to the other. So the cerebrum has two hemispheres and six lobes. So the lobes, the four main lobes are the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe has to do with speech, which right here, the frontal lobe, right? The frontal lobe has to do with talking, speech. language, thought, processing information, and intelligence. So the frontal lobe has to do with motor functioning and higher order functions. Higher order functions like speech, thought, language, processing, intelligence, hence the higher order, right? And so this has to do mostly with the outputs of the brain, the output. And I'll break it down right now, what that means. And so that's the first main lobe of the cerebrum is the frontal lobe. And then next is the parietal lobe. It's the somatosensory lobe. So somatosensory has to do with touch. Remember, soma meaning the body, senses of the body. So touch. The parietal is somatosensory, so it has to do with touch. The parietal lobe has to do with touch. The temporal lobe has to do with the audition, the auditory, which is hearing, has to do with hearing and processing sound. The temporal lobe, think about temporal lobe has to do with hearing and processing sound. The occipital lobe, which is in the back, has to do with vision, with visual. So we have the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, which has to do with touch, the temporal, which has to do with sound, the occipital lobe has to do with vision. And then there's also two possible, there's other lobes which are possible, which hence makes up the 6 lobes supposedly. But there's 4 main ones. So the other ones are the limbic and the insular. He didn't really speak much about the limbic lobe of the cerebrum. But he didn't mention the insular. It has to do with hearing, like knowing who's talking, and also other emotions. But let me go to this idea of how the brain works with inputs and outputs. So the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe has to do with touch, right? So if you touch something, is that information getting sent into the brain or is it coming out of the brain as an output? When I touch something, I feel a sensation. It's going into the brain and it's processing what I'm feeling, whether it be pain or pleasure. So that's an input, right? And then when I see something, is that information getting inputted or outputted from the brain? The brain is inputting that information. So the parietal and the occipital lobes are inputs into the brain. And so is the temporal, which has to do with sound, auditory, processing sound. I'm hearing something and it's an input into my brain and processing. So the one lobe in the brain that actually is an output is the frontal lobe. It's processing sound and what it's hearing, and it's processing touch, taste, and it's outputting, and it's causing cognition, it's causing motor functioning, right? So it's very fascinating, very fascinating. That's what we learned so far. This fucking video is over 35 minutes. It'll be all right, y'all. So I pretty much studied right here, I guess, right? It's not fucking, but I'm actually like I'm building an affinity for the way the brain works. I really like it. I really like it. Uh, it's interesting, but it does require medical school. Why not? Probably some weirdos over there like me. Anyway, peace.